Let me tell you something that might change the way you think about aging, about your body, about the very fabric of what it means to grow older in this modern world we've created. I want to talk to you about something that's happening right now, in this very moment, inside your brain and your muscles, something that connects the deepest parts of your neural circuitry to the physical reality of how your body heals, how it rebuilds, how it refuses to give up even when everything around you seems to be telling you that decline is inevitable. This is about dopamine, that magnificent neurotransmitter that everyone talks about but few truly understand, and this is about your muscles, those incredible engines of movement that define so much of your independence, your vitality, your connection to the world around you. You see, I've spent decades working with people who are struggling, people who are trying to understand why their bodies aren't responding the way they used to, why recovery takes longer, why that fall last month still has them limping, why the simple act of getting up from a chair has become an exercise in determination rather than an automatic reflex. And what I've discovered, what the science has revealed to us over these past years, is that there's a hidden connection, a secret conversation happening between your brain's reward system and your body's ability to heal, to regenerate, to maintain the muscle mass and strength that keeps you moving through this world with confidence and joy. Let me take you back to a patient I met several years ago, a woman named Margaret who came into my office at 72 years old. Margaret had been an athlete in her youth, a runner who had completed marathons well into her 50s, someone who prided herself on her physical capability, her independence, her refusal to let age define her limitations. But something had changed. She'd fallen on an icy sidewalk 18 months before she came to see me, broken her hip, had surgery, did everything the doctors told her to do, followed the physical therapy protocols to the letter, and yet here she was, 18 months later, still struggling, still weak, still unable to climb the stairs in her home without holding onto the railing with both hands, still feeling like her body had betrayed her in some fundamental way. Margaret wasn't depressed in the clinical sense, but there was something in her eyes, something in the way she talked about her body, that told me she'd lost something more than just muscle strength. She'd lost hope. She'd lost the belief that her body could still be a source of pleasure, of accomplishment, of the kind of physical joy that had defined so much of her life. And as I listened to her story, as I learned about her daily routines, her sleep patterns, her social connections, her relationship with exercise and movement, I began to see a pattern that I'd seen before, a pattern that connects the dots between brain chemistry and physical healing in ways that most people, even most doctors, don't fully appreciate. Here's what you need to understand about dopamine. It's not just the pleasure chemical, not just the reward molecule that fires when you eat chocolate, or check your phone, or win at cards. Dopamine is the anticipation molecule, the motivation chemical, the neurotransmitter that gets you out of bed in the morning and propels you toward your goals. It's the chemical signature of wanting, of striving, of believing that effort will lead to reward. And here's the crucial part, the part that changes everything when we think about aging and muscle health. Dopamine doesn't just make you feel good. It doesn't just motivate you to move. It actually plays a direct role in the biological processes of muscle protein synthesis, muscle repair, and muscle growth. When you're young, when your dopamine system is functioning at its peak, this connection between motivation and muscle healing is seamless, invisible, automatic. You get injured, your brain registers the damage. Dopamine pathways light up in response to the challenge of recovery. You feel motivated to do your physical therapy, to push through the discomfort, to trust that your effort will pay off, and lo and behold, your muscles respond. The protein synthesis machinery kicks into gear, satellite cells proliferate and fuse with damaged muscle fibers, inflammation resolves in a timely fashion, and you heal. You get stronger. You return to your activities with confidence and maybe even a story to tell about your resilience. But after 60, something changes. The dopamine system, like so many other biological systems, begins to show its age. The neurons that produce dopamine in the substantia nigra and the ventral tegmental area, those critical brain regions that supply dopamine to the rest of your nervous system, they start to decline. Not catastrophically, not in the dramatic way we see in Parkinson's disease, but gradually, incrementally, year by year. By the time you reach 70, you might have 20 or 30% fewer dopamine-producing neurons than you had at 30. The receptors that respond to dopamine, they become less sensitive, less responsive, like a radio that's slowly losing its ability to pick up the signal clearly. And here's where it gets really interesting, where the story becomes not just about brain chemistry, but about the intimate connection between mind and body, between motivation and metabolism, between how we feel and how we heal. When your dopamine system is depleted, when those reward pathways are firing at half strength, several things happen simultaneously. First, you lose motivation. Exercise feels harder, not just physically but psychologically. The anticipation of movement, which used to bring a sense of eagerness or at least acceptance, now brings dread. You start avoiding activities that used to be routine. You take the elevator instead of the stairs. You drive to the mailbox instead of walking. You decline invitations to go for walks with friends, because the effort seems disproportionate to the reward. Second, your pain perception changes. Dopamine plays a crucial role in pain modulation, in how your brain processes and responds to discomfort. When dopamine levels drop, pain signals get amplified. That sore muscle that would have been a minor annoyance at 40% now feels like a major injury at 70. The discomfort of physical therapy, which requires you to work muscles that are weak and damaged, becomes intolerable rather than merely challenging. You start to protect yourself, to avoid movement, to let your body stiffen and weaken in the name of avoiding pain. Third, and this is where the biology gets really fascinating, your muscles themselves become less responsive to the signals that normally trigger growth and repair. There's emerging evidence that dopamine receptors exist, not just in your brain, but in your muscle tissue itself. When these receptors are activated by dopamine, they enhance the anabolic response to exercise. They amplify the effects of growth factors. They help orchestrate the complex dance of inflammation and repair that turns the damage of exercise into the strength of adaptation. But when dopamine is depleted, when those receptors aren't getting adequate stimulation, the whole process becomes sluggish, inefficient, incomplete. So you end up in what I call the dopamine muscle depletion spiral. Low dopamine makes you less motivated to move, which means less exercise, which means less muscle stimulation, which means muscle atrophy, which makes movement harder and more painful, which further reduces motivation, which further depletes dopamine because you're no longer getting the natural dopamine boost that comes from physical activity and accomplishment. Around and around you go, each turn of the spiral taking you further from the vital, capable person you used to be, further into a version of aging that feels like defeat rather than evolution. Margaret was caught in this spiral when she came to see me. The hip fracture had been the trigger, the event that had knocked her off course. But the real problem wasn't the bone, wasn't even the muscle damage from the surgery and the immobility that followed. The real problem was that her dopamine system, already compromised by age, had been further depleted by the trauma, the pain, the loss of her athletic identity, the months of reduced activity. She'd lost her dopamine tone, and with it, she'd lost her ability to heal effectively. Now, before I tell you what we did for Margaret, before I give you the roadmap for how to fix this problem in your own life, I want you to understand something crucial about the modern world and how it's making this dopamine depletion crisis even worse. We're living in an age of unprecedented stimulation, unprecedented access to cheap, easy, immediate sources of dopamine release. Every time you check your phone, every time you scroll through social media, every time you binge watch a television series or eat highly processed foods engineered to hijack your reward system, you're getting little hits of dopamine, little bursts of pleasure that feel good in the moment but that are actually making your underlying dopamine deficit worse. Here's why. Your brain is designed to maintain balance, to keep your dopamine system calibrated to a baseline level that allows you to find motivation and pleasure in the normal activities of life. Activities like moving your body, connecting with other people, accomplishing meaningful tasks, experiencing the natural beauty of the world around you. But when you flood your system with these artificial, supernormal stimuli, when you give yourself constant access to dopamine hits that require no effort and provide no lasting satisfaction, your brain compensates by downregulating the system, by reducing the number of receptors, by making you less sensitive to dopamine's effects. It's like turning up the volume on a radio to hear a song, and then finding that all the other stations now sound too quiet. You've reset your baseline, but in the wrong direction. Now the normal activities of life, including the physical activity that's essential for maintaining muscle health, can't generate enough dopamine to motivate you, to give you that sense of reward and accomplishment that makes effort feel worthwhile. You're caught between two fires, the natural age-related decline in dopamine function and the modern world's assault on your reward system through constant overstimulation. And here's the particularly insidious part for people over 60. Many of you have more time on your hands than you did when you were working full-time raising children, managing the busy demands of midlife. That time which should be an opportunity for physical activity, for social connection, for engaging in meaningful pursuits that naturally boost dopamine in healthy ways, instead becomes time spent in passive consumption, scrolling, watching, snacking, seeking comfort in the easy dopamine hits that actually make you weaker, less motivated, less capable of doing the things that would truly improve your health and your life. So what do we do about this? How do we break the spiral? How do we restore dopamine function? And with it, the ability of your muscles to heal, to grow, to keep you strong and independent and engaged with life? The answer is both simple and challenging, both ancient and cutting edge, both something you already know at some level, and something that will require you to completely rethink your relationship with pleasure, pain, and the process of aging itself. The first step, and this is the step that most people resist because it feels like deprivation, is to reduce the artificial dopamine stimulation in your life. I'm talking about a dopamine fast, a period of deliberate withdrawal from the easy hits, the constant stimulation, the comfort-seeking behaviors that are keeping your reward system in a depleted state. This means reducing or eliminating screen time, particularly social media and passive entertainment. This means cleaning up your diet, removing the processed foods, the sugar, the salt and fat combinations that light up your brain's reward centers without providing real nourishment. This means being honest about any substances you're using to feel good, whether it's alcohol or prescription pain medications or over-the-counter sleep aids, and considering whether these short-term solutions are contributing to your long-term problem. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that at your age, you've earned the right to these small pleasures, these comforts, these ways of making the day feel less hard and more manageable. And I'm not telling you that you need to live like a monk, that you can never enjoy a glass of wine or watch your favorite show or check in on social media to see what your grandchildren are doing. What I'm telling you is that if your current level of engagement with these stimuli is keeping you trapped in the dopamine depletion spiral, if it's robbing you of your physical vitality and your ability to heal and maintain your muscle strength, then maybe, just maybe, it's time to recalibrate. Margaret, when I presented this idea to her, was resistant at first. She told me that her evening routine of watching television for 3 or 4 hours was one of her few remaining pleasures, that it helped her relax, that it made her feel less lonely. And I didn't judge her for that. Didn't tell her she was wrong to seek comfort in this way. Instead, I asked her to try an experiment. For just 2 weeks, I asked her to limit her screen time to 1 hour per day, to spend the time she would have spent watching television doing something else, anything else, even if it was just sitting quietly, reading a book, or calling a friend on the phone. The first few days were hard. She felt bored, restless, irritable. She described feeling like there was a hole in her evening, a void that needed to be filled. This is withdrawal, I explained to her. This is what it feels like when you've been using something to artificially boost your dopamine and you stop. Your brain is temporarily in deficit, scrambling to recalibrate, sending you signals that something is wrong, that you need to return to the source of pleasure to feel okay again. But if you can sit with this discomfort, if you can resist the urge to fill the void immediately with another source of easy dopamine, something remarkable happens. After about a week, Margaret started to notice changes, small things at first. She found herself looking forward to her morning coffee in a way she hadn't in years, actually tasting it, enjoying it, rather than just using it to wake up. She noticed the birds at her feeder, found herself watching them with genuine interest, rather than just glancing out the window while thinking about something else. She called an old friend she hadn't spoken to in months, and they talked for over an hour, and afterward Margaret felt energized rather than drained. Her brain was starting to recalibrate, starting to find pleasure and reward in the simple, natural activities of life. And then something else happened. Margaret found herself thinking about walking. Not forcing herself to walk, not guilting herself into exercise, but actually wanting to move her body. One morning she put on her shoes and walked to the end of her driveway. The next day she walked to the corner. Within 2 weeks of reducing her screen time, she was walking 20 minutes a day, not because anyone was telling her to, not because she was trying to be good or do what the doctor ordered, but because it felt good, because it gave her a sense of accomplishment, because her brain was starting to reward her for this natural, healthy behavior. This is the power of letting your dopamine system reset. When you remove the artificial stimulation, when you create space for your brain to recalibrate to baseline, you rediscover your natural capacity for motivation, for finding pleasure in effort, for experiencing the reward that comes from doing hard things. And this motivation, this renewed engagement with physical activity, this is the foundation for everything else that needs to happen to restore your muscle health. But reducing artificial stimulation is only the first step. The second step is to strategically increase the activities and behaviors that naturally, healthily boost dopamine in ways that support rather than undermine your physical health. And the number one activity on this list, the gold standard for natural dopamine enhancement, is exercise itself. But not just any exercise. We're talking about exercise that's challenging enough to require real effort, that pushes you slightly beyond your comfort zone, that gives you that sense of accomplishment when you finish. Here's the beautiful paradox at the heart of this whole system. Exercise requires dopamine for motivation, but exercise also produces dopamine as a result. When you move your body, when you challenge your muscles, when you get your heart rate up and feel that sense of exertion, your brain responds by releasing dopamine. It's nature's reward system for doing the things that keep you healthy and strong. But here's the catch. If your dopamine system is too depleted, if you're too far down the spiral, you can't generate enough motivation to exercise, which means you can't get the dopamine boost that comes from exercise, which means you stay stuck. This is why the dopamine fast is so crucial. It's the reset button that allows you to access the motivation you need to start moving again. But once you begin to exercise regularly, even in small ways, you create a positive feedback loop. Exercise boosts dopamine, which increases motivation, which makes you more likely to exercise again tomorrow, which boosts dopamine more, and around you go, but this time in a positive spiral, each turn taking you closer to strength, independence, and vitality rather than further away. Now let me tell you about the specific type of exercise that's most important for people over 60 who are trying to rebuild muscle and restore dopamine function. We're talking about resistance training, strength training, the kind of exercise that puts your muscles under load and forces them to adapt by getting stronger. I know that many of you, when you think about exercise, think about walking or swimming or gentle yoga, and these activities have their place. They're valuable for cardiovascular health and mobility and stress reduction. But if we're talking about specifically addressing the dopamine-muscle connection, if we're talking about reversing sarcopenia and restoring the strength and resilience of your muscles, nothing compares to resistance training. Here's why. When you lift weights, when you do body weight exercises like squats and push-ups, when you use resistance bands or machines to challenge your muscles against force, you create microscopic damage in the muscle fibers. This sounds bad, but it's actually exactly what needs to happen for muscles to grow and strengthen. Your body perceives this damage and responds by initiating a repair process that not only fixes the damage, but actually builds the muscle back stronger than it was before. A process called supercompensation. This is how adaptation works. This is how your body gets stronger. But here's where dopamine comes into the picture. The process of muscle protein synthesis, the cellular machinery that rebuilds and strengthens your muscles after resistance training, is heavily influenced by dopamine signaling. When you have adequate dopamine function, when those receptors in your muscle tissue are being properly stimulated, the anabolic response to resistance training is robust and efficient. Your muscles recover faster, grow stronger, become more resilient. When dopamine is depleted, this process is compromised. You might do the exercise, you might put in the effort, but the results are disappointing. The adaptation is incomplete, the strength gains are minimal. This is why so many people over 60 report that exercise doesn't work for them anymore, that they can work hard in physical therapy or at the gym, but they don't seem to get stronger, don't seem to see results. It's not that their muscles are incapable of adaptation, it's that the dopamine signaling required for optimal adaptation is impaired. By addressing the dopamine problem first, by resetting your baseline and then strategically boosting dopamine through exercise itself, you create the conditions for your muscles to respond the way they're supposed to, the way they still can even at 70 or 80 or 90 years old. Margaret started with very simple resistance exercises. She was still recovering from her hip fracture, still dealing with weakness and fear around movement, so we kept it basic, sitting in a chair and standing up without using her hands, holding onto the kitchen counter and doing calf raises, using a resistance band to do rows and shoulder presses while sitting down. Nothing fancy, nothing that required expensive equipment or a gym membership, just simple movements that put her muscles under load and challenged them to adapt. At first, as I expected, she found it hard. Not just physically hard, although it was that too, but psychologically hard. The effort seemed disproportionate to the immediate reward. She felt discouraged by how weak she was, how much strength she'd lost. But I encouraged her to stick with it, to trust the process, to remember that she was rebuilding not just her muscles but her dopamine system, and that the two would support each other if she could just persist through the early difficult phase. And then, about 3 weeks into her resistance training program, something clicked. Margaret came into my office with a different energy, a brightness in her eyes that I hadn't seen before. She told me that she'd done an extra set of squats that morning because she'd wanted to, because it felt good to challenge herself, because she could feel herself getting stronger. This is the moment I wait for with every patient. The moment when the positive feedback loop kicks in, when effort starts to feel rewarding rather than punishing, when the person reconnects with their body as a source of capability and pleasure rather than just pain and limitation. From that point forward, Margaret's progress accelerated. She added more exercises, increased the resistance, pushed herself a little harder each week. Our muscles responded. Within 3 months, she was climbing stairs without holding the railing. Within 6 months, she was walking 3 miles at a time, something she hadn't done since before her fall. But more important than these physical markers, more important than the measurable gains in strength and endurance, was the change in how Margaret felt, in how she thought about herself and her body and her future. She'd escaped the dopamine depletion spiral. She'd rebuilt her reward system to support rather than undermine her physical health. She'd rediscovered the deep, abiding pleasure that comes from being strong, from being capable, from moving through the world with confidence and joy. And she'd done it not by denying the reality of aging, not by pretending she could turn back the clock, but by working with her biology, understanding the connections between brain and body, and creating the conditions for adaptation and growth that are possible at any age. Now, I want to talk about some of the other factors that influence dopamine function and muscle health in people over 60, because resistance exercise and reducing artificial stimulation, while crucial, are not the whole story. Sleep is absolutely critical. Your brain produces and regulates dopamine during sleep, particularly during the deep stages of non-REM sleep. If you're not getting adequate sleep, if you're surviving on 6 hours a night, or your sleep is fragmented and poor quality, your dopamine system can't recover and reset the way it needs to. Many people over 60 struggle with sleep. Maybe you're dealing with pain that wakes you up at night. Maybe you have sleep apnea that's disrupting your rest without you even realizing it. Maybe you've fallen into habits that undermine good sleep, like drinking alcohol in the evening, or watching television in bed, or keeping your bedroom too warm or too bright. Whatever the cause, poor sleep is a major contributor to dopamine depletion, and addressing your sleep quality needs to be part of your strategy for restoring dopamine function and muscle health. The fundamentals of good sleep are well established, even if they're not always easy to implement. You need a dark, cool, quiet room. You need a consistent sleep schedule, going to bed and waking up at roughly the same time every day, even on weekends. You need to avoid screens for at least an hour before bed. because the blue light they emit suppresses melatonin production and keeps your brain in an activated state. You need to avoid alcohol, which might help you fall asleep, but fragments your sleep architecture and prevents you from getting the deep, restorative sleep you need. You need to manage any medical conditions like sleep apnea or restless leg syndrome that might be disrupting your rest without your conscious awareness. I know these recommendations sound basic, maybe even simplistic, but basic doesn't mean unimportant. Sleep is the foundation upon which everything else is built. If you're not sleeping well, you can do everything else right. You can exercise religiously and eat perfectly and manage your stress beautifully, and you'll still struggle to restore dopamine function and rebuild your muscles. Sleep is non-negotiable. Social connection is another crucial factor, and one that's often overlooked when we talk about physical health and muscle maintenance. Humans are social creatures. We're wired for connection, for belonging, for feeling part of something larger than ourselves, and dopamine is intimately involved in the reward we feel from positive social interactions. When you have a good conversation with a friend, when you feel understood and appreciated, when you laugh together or work together toward a common goal, your brain releases dopamine. This is one of the primary ways that our reward system is designed to function, to reinforce the behaviors and relationships that support our survival and well-being. But many people over 60 are socially isolated. Maybe you've retired from work and lost the daily interactions with colleagues. Maybe you've lost a spouse and haven't rebuilt your social network. Maybe your children live far away and you see them infrequently. Maybe physical limitations make it harder to get out and engage with your community. Whatever the reason, social isolation is both a cause and a consequence of dopamine depletion. When you're isolated, you don't get the natural dopamine boost that comes from positive social interaction, which makes you less motivated to reach out and connect, which deepens your isolation, which further depletes your dopamine. And here's the connection to muscle health that many people don't appreciate. Social connection motivates physical activity. When you have friends you meet for walks, when you're part of a group fitness class, when you have social obligations that require you to get dressed and leave the house and move your body, you're more likely to stay active. The social reward and the physical activity reward combine and amplify each other, creating a powerful motivation to keep moving even when it's hard, even when you don't feel like it. Margaret's recovery wasn't just about exercise and sleep and dopamine reset. A crucial part of her transformation was joining a senior fitness class at her local community center. She'd resisted this at first, telling me she wasn't a group person, that she preferred to exercise alone. But I encouraged her to try it, just once, just to see how it felt. That first class turned into a regular twice-weekly commitment. Margaret made friends. She found herself looking forward to the class, not just for the exercise, but for the conversation before and after, for the sense of belonging, for the shared experience of working hard and getting stronger together. The social connection and the physical activity created a synergy that accelerated her recovery in ways that either factor alone could not have achieved. This is the power of understanding the whole system, of recognizing that dopamine and muscle health are not isolated problems, but are embedded in the larger context of how you live your life, how you connect with others, how you find meaning and purpose and pleasure in your daily existence. Nutrition is another piece of the puzzle that we need to address. Your brain needs certain raw materials to produce dopamine, and if you're not getting adequate amounts of these nutrients from your diet, your dopamine production will be compromised no matter what else you do. The amino acid tyrosine is the precursor to dopamine, meaning your brain uses tyrosine to synthesize dopamine molecules. You get tyrosine from protein-rich foods like meat, fish, eggs, dairy, legumes, nuts, and seeds. If your diet is low in protein, if you're surviving on toast and tea and the occasional bowl of soup, you're not giving your brain the building blocks it needs to produce adequate dopamine. Many people over 60 don't eat enough protein. Maybe you've lost your appetite with age. Maybe you're living alone and don't feel motivated to cook full meals. Maybe you have dental problems that make it harder to chew meat. Maybe you're on a fixed income and protein foods seem expensive. Whatever the reason, inadequate protein intake is both a cause of muscle loss, because your muscles need dietary protein to maintain and rebuild themselves, and a cause of dopamine depletion, because your brain needs protein-derived amino acids to produce dopamine. The research suggests that people over 60 actually need more protein than younger adults, not less. The standard recommendation is 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. But for older adults, especially those who are trying to maintain or build muscle mass, the optimal intake is probably closer to 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram per day. For a person weighing 70 kilograms, that's 70 to 84 grams of protein per day, spread across multiple meals. This might sound like a lot, and it can be challenging to achieve, but it's absolutely essential if you're serious about restoring muscle health. Every meal should include a significant source of protein: eggs for breakfast, chicken or fish for lunch, legumes or lean meat for dinner, and maybe some Greek yogurt or nuts as snacks. This kind of consistent protein intake gives your muscles the amino acids they need for repair and growth, and it gives your brain the tyrosine it needs for dopamine production. There are also specific micronutrients that support dopamine function. Iron is required for the enzymes that synthesize dopamine. Vitamin B6 is a cofactor in the conversion of tyrosine to dopamine. Folate and vitamin B12 support the overall health of dopaminergic neurons. Magnesium plays a role in dopamine receptor function. If you're deficient in any of these nutrients, and many older adults are, your dopamine system will be compromised. I'm not suggesting you need to take a dozen supplements or obsess over every micronutrient in your diet. What I'm suggesting is that you eat a varied, nutrient-dense diet that includes plenty of vegetables, particularly dark leafy greens, a variety of protein sources, some healthy fats from nuts and fish and olive oil, and maybe a basic multivitamin to cover your bases if your diet isn't perfect. Good nutrition isn't complicated, but it is important, and it's one of the factors that's entirely within your control. Now let's talk about pain, because pain is one of the major obstacles that keeps people from exercising, from moving, from doing the things that would rebuild their dopamine and their muscles. And the relationship between dopamine and pain is fascinating and complex. Dopamine is involved in pain modulation. It doesn't eliminate pain, but it changes how your brain processes and responds to pain signals. When dopamine is adequate, you have a higher pain threshold. You're better able to tolerate discomfort. You can distinguish between pain that signals danger and pain that's just part of the effort of challenging your body. When dopamine is depleted, pain becomes magnified, overwhelming, intolerable. Everything hurts more. The sore muscles from exercise feel like injury. The discomfort of stretching feels like damage. The normal aches and pains of an aging body feel like evidence that you're falling apart. And because pain is so aversive, because our natural instinct is to avoid things that hurt, you stop moving, you become more sedentary, you let your body stiffen and weaken in the name of avoiding pain. But here's the cruel irony. By avoiding movement to avoid pain, you actually make the pain worse in the long run. Muscles that aren't used become weak and tight. Joints that aren't moved through their full range of motion become stiff and prone to injury. The nervous system becomes hypersensitive, interpreting normal sensations as painful. You end up in more pain, not less, and with even less capacity to do the things that would actually help. The way out of this trap is to rebuild your dopamine function while simultaneously, gradually, carefully reintroducing movement. You start small, so small that the pain is manageable, tolerable, not overwhelming. Maybe it's just 5 minutes of gentle movement. Maybe it's just a few repetitions of one exercise. Maybe it's just a short walk around your house. The goal isn't to push through pain or ignore pain. It's to find the level of activity that challenges you without overwhelming you, that produces some discomfort but not intolerable pain. And then, as your dopamine system recovers, as you reduce the artificial stimulation and increase the natural dopamine-boosting activities, something remarkable happens. Your pain tolerance improves. The same activity that felt excruciating 2 weeks ago now feels merely challenging. The soreness from exercise, which used to seem like evidence of damage, now feels like evidence of effort, of adaptation, of your body getting stronger. You develop what researchers call exercise self-efficacy. The confidence that you can move your body without hurting yourself, that you can push yourself and recover, that you can trust your body to adapt rather than break down. Margaret dealt with significant pain in her recovery from hip fracture. The surgery itself, the months of immobility, the muscle atrophy, all of this created a pain syndrome that went beyond the original injury. She was afraid to move, afraid of re-injuring herself, hyper-focused on every sensation in her hip and leg. This fear and hypervigilance actually made her pain worse, kept her trapped in a cycle of avoidance and worsening disability. Part of our work together was helping Margaret understand pain, helping her distinguish between hurt and harm, helping her learn that some discomfort during exercise was not only normal but necessary for adaptation. We used a pain scale, asking her to rate her pain during and after exercise, and we established a working range, a level of discomfort that was challenging but not overwhelming, usually around a 3 or 4 out of 10. We agreed that if her pain went above this level, she would back off, but that if it stayed within the tolerable range, she would push through, trusting that her body was adapting rather than breaking down. This approach worked because Margaret's dopamine system was recovering at the same time. If we'd tried this in the beginning, when her dopamine was depleted and her pain tolerance was low, it would have failed. She wouldn't have been able to tolerate even mild discomfort. But because we'd already done the work of reducing artificial stimulation, improving her sleep, encouraging social connection, optimizing her nutrition, her pain processing system was healthier, more resilient, better able to distinguish between pain that signals danger and pain that's just part of the work of getting stronger. Let me talk now about purpose and meaning, because these psychological factors are intimately connected to dopamine function and to your motivation to take care of your body. Dopamine is the motivation molecule, but it needs something to be motivated toward. It needs goals, purposes, reasons to get out of bed in the morning and engage with life. If you've lost your sense of purpose, if retirement or loss or declining health has left you feeling like your best days are behind you, like there's nothing worth striving for anymore, then your dopamine system will reflect this lack of purpose. You'll feel unmotivated, listless, disconnected from the things that used to bring you pleasure and engagement. And when you lack purpose, when you don't have compelling reasons to stay strong and active and engaged with life, then maintaining your physical health feels pointless. Why bother with exercise? Why push through the discomfort? Why make the effort? It's not that you consciously decide to let yourself decline. It's that the motivation just isn't there. And without motivation, without that dopamine-driven drive to strive and achieve and become, the behaviors that maintain health fall away. This is why one of the questions I always ask my older patients is, what are you living for? What gets you out of bed in the morning? What are you looking forward to? What would you like to be able to do that you can't do now? These aren't just philosophical questions, they're practical questions about dopamine and motivation and the psychological foundations of physical health. Margaret's initial answer to these questions was heartbreaking. She told me she wasn't really living for anything, she was just surviving, getting through each day, waiting for the end. Her children were grown and busy with their own lives. Her husband had died 5 years earlier, her running days were over. She couldn't see a future worth striving for. This lack of purpose was as much a barrier to her recovery as her depleted dopamine or her muscle atrophy. But as Margaret's physical health improved, as she got stronger and more capable, something else changed too. She started to envision possibilities. Maybe she could travel to visit her daughter across the country, something she hadn't felt capable of since her injury. Maybe she could volunteer at the animal shelter, something she'd always wanted to do but hadn't had time for when she was working. Maybe she could mentor younger runners at the local running club, sharing her knowledge and experience, even if she couldn't run herself anymore. These emerging purposes, these visions of a future worth striving for, they fed back into her motivation to exercise, to take care of her body, to continue doing the hard work of recovery and maintenance. Purpose and physical capability reinforced each other in a positive spiral. The stronger she got, the more she could envision doing, and the more she could envision doing, the more motivated she was to keep getting stronger.